When I finally caught my son Leo on a FaceTime call to ask what time I should head to the airport for the wedding, my daughter-in-law Tiffany leaned into the frame with a hollow, rehearsed laugh and said, "Oh, Grace, didn't we tell you? The wedding was actually this morning. We just wanted a very specific modern vibe for the photos, and we thought you'd be more comfortable at home." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. A modern vibe. I was the vibe that didn't fit. The 68-year-old mother who had just spent the last 3 years living in a cramped, downsized apartment so I could hand Leo $25,000 for their house down payment. Apparently, my money had a vibe, but I didn't. I sat there at my kitchen table, holding my phone as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, watching my son stare at a spot on the floor behind Tiffany while she adjusted her hair in the reflection of the screen. Behind them, I could see the marble fireplace of the estate they had rented. An estate that cost $8,000 for the weekend, paid for by the early inheritance check I'd signed over just last month. The silver silk suit I had bought for the ceremony hung uselessly on the back of my bedroom door, alongside the matching low-heeled shoes I'd spent 2 hours picking out so I wouldn't trip walking down the aisle. I had spent $400 on that outfit, imagining the moment Leo would take my arm and lead me to the front row. Now those photos would be taken, posted, and liked by thousands, and I would be as invisible as the air. 4 months, I had been their silent partner. I had covered Tiffany's bridal wellness retreats and paid for the premium open bar they'd insisted on. I had even called my old teaching colleagues to brag about how happy my boy was. All of that pride, all of those sacrifices, evaporated in a single second with those 5 poisoned words. More comfortable at home. The FaceTime call ended with a soft, digital click, but the silence that followed was deafening. I sat at my kitchen table, the screen of my phone dark, reflecting the face of a woman I hardly recognized. A 68-year-old retired teacher who had just been told she was a vibe killer. I didn't cry. The shock was too cold for tears. Instead, I stood up with a mechanical stiffness and walked to the small corner desk where I kept my laptop and my neatly filed accordion folders. For years, I had managed my finances with the precision of a woman who had spent 4 decades grading papers. I pulled out the folder labeled Leo and Tiffany, and opened my banking portal. I needed to see it. I needed to see the numbers, stripped of the emotional excuses I had used to justify them. The first page of the ledger was a list of emergencies. I remembered the frantic call from Leo 3 years ago. "Mom, the car is making a noise. I can't get to work." I looked at the transfer. $4,500. Then there was Tiffany's career development course, a $3,000 seminar on social media branding that had resulted in nothing but more photos of her at brunch. As I scrolled, the entries began to blur into a singular, agonizing pattern of exploitation. I took out a red pen and a fresh sheet of paper. I began to tally the early inheritance checks I had written, the ones they told me would help them secure their future. $10,000 for a business venture that never started. $15,000 for the down payment on the house that I wasn't allowed to visit today because my presence would ruin the modern aesthetic. I looked at a receipt from 6 months ago. $200 for a designer handbag Tiffany had accidentally put on the joint credit card I kept for their groceries. When I'd questioned it, Leo had told me I was being controlling and forgetful, suggesting that maybe I had told her to treat herself and simply didn't remember. I had apologized. I had actually apologized for her theft. By the time I reached the bottom of the second page, the total staring back at me was $42,650. $42,000. That wasn't just money. That was my peace of mind. That was the European tour I had cancelled after my husband died. That was the kitchen remodel I had postponed. That was the security of my final years, handed over in installments to 2 people who viewed me as nothing more than a malfunctioning vending machine. I looked at the silver silk suit hanging on the door. It wasn't just a garment. It was a costume for a play I was never cast in. I realized then that I hadn't been a mother to Leo for a long time. I had been an unpaid investor in a life that didn't include me. Every "I love you, Mom" had been followed by a request for a transfer. Every "we miss you" was a prelude to a bill they couldn't pay. The realization settled in my gut like lead. They hadn't excluded me from the wedding because of the vibe. They had excluded me because once the checks are signed, the banker is just a nuisance. They wanted my money in their accounts, but they didn't want my face in their photos. They wanted the lifestyle I provided, but they were ashamed of the woman who provided it. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing with a cold, sharp clarity. The red pen was still in my hand. I circled the final total, $42,650, and underlined it so hard the paper nearly tore. Too old for the vibe, I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded different, thicker, steadier. The woman who walked on eggshells and apologized for her own existence was gone. In her place was the teacher who knew exactly how to handle a bully. I closed the laptop and tucked the red-inked ledger into the front of the folder. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a woman who had just realized she owned the mortgage on a house of cards, and I was more than ready to stop holding up the walls. The vibe was about to change, and for the first time in years, I was the one who was going to be comfortable. I stood up, walked to the closet, and took the silver silk suit off the hanger. I didn't put it away. I put it in a box. It was time to stop waiting for an invitation and start planning a reckoning. The digital glow of my laptop was the only light in the kitchen as I began the surgical process of reclaiming my life. My fingers, once hesitant to even question a bank statement, now moved with a cold, rhythmic certainty. I felt like a technician disarming a bomb that had been ticking in my pocket for years. First, I navigated to the recurring payment for Leo's car, a high-performance SUV that cost more per month than my first 3 years of teaching salary combined. He had told me it was essential for his professional image, a lie I'd swallowed because I wanted him to feel successful. I hovered the cursor over the cancel button. With a sharp, satisfying click, the payment was gone. I imagined the luxury leather seats and the sleek dashboard suddenly turning into a pumpkin. Next was the credit card I'd authorized for Tiffany's wedding beauty expenses. I scrolled through the recent charges. $800 for eyelash extensions and a gold leaf facial, $1,200 for a pre-wedding retreat, and a staggering $2,500 for a post-elopement glow spa package. These were the costs of the aesthetic that was too modern for my presence. I called the card issuer, my voice as steady as a stone. I'd like to report the authorized user cards as revoked, I told the representative. Effective immediately. Please freeze all pending transactions. Is there a problem with the account, Mrs. Richter? The woman asked. Yes, I replied. The account is being used by people who no longer exist in my budget. I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness, waiting. 2,000 miles away, in their luxury, vibe-heavy bubble, the bells were about to stop ringing. It didn't take long. My phone began to vibrate on the table. A frantic series of pings from the family group chat. Mom. The card was declined at the resort checkout. There must be a mistake. Then a text from Leo. The bank sent an alert about the car payment. Fix it, Mom. I have a meeting tomorrow. I didn't reply. I poured myself a glass of water and watched the clock. The silence of the house was punctuated by the increasingly desperate buzzing of the phone, but I felt no urge to pick it up. The ATM was out of service, and for the first time in years, the banker was sleeping soundly. The confrontation came 36 hours later. I was in the garden, pruning the roses I had neglected while I was busy tending to their lives, when a car screeched into my driveway. It wasn't the luxury SUV that had likely already been flagged, but a rental. Leo and Tiffany practically fell out of the vehicle, their faces flushed not with the glow of newlyweds, but with the raw, ugly heat of entitlement. What the hell is this, Grace? Tiffany screamed before she even reached the porch. Gone was the airy, modern voice from the FaceTime call. She looked disheveled, her expensive extensions tangled from the flight. We were at the airport trying to upgrade our seats home, and the card wouldn't even buy a bottle of water. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Leo marched up behind her, his jaw set in a line of practiced indignation. Mom, this is beyond petty. We talked about this. You agreed to help us through the wedding year. You can't just flip a switch because you're feeling sensitive about a small misunderstanding. I stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from my gardening gloves. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I'd funded, and I realized he didn't see a mother. He saw a broken machine that needed to be kicked back into gear. A small misunderstanding? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Is that what we're calling the $8,000 estate rental I paid for? Or the first-class tickets for Tiffany's family while I sat here waiting for a flight time that didn't exist? You're being dramatic, Leo snapped. We were going to pay you back. But now you've put my credit at risk. You've put our reputation at risk. Your reputation. I let out a short, sharp laugh that made Tiffany flinch. You're worried about your reputation with the resort staff? I'm worried about my retirement, Leo. I'm worried about the $42,000 I've bled into your vibe, while I lived in a one-bedroom apartment to save you money. You promised that money to us. Tiffany stepped forward, her eyes narrow and predatory. It was an early inheritance. You can't just take back a gift. That's not how this works. It's exactly how it works when the gift was predicated on the lie that I was a member of this family, I said. I walked toward them, and for the first time, they were the ones who backed away. The tap is dry. The car, the spa, the modern aesthetic, it's over. If you want a luxury life, I suggest you find a way to pay for it that doesn't involve my social security checks. You're crazy, Leo whispered, looking at Tiffany with a panicked expression. You're actually losing it. People our age don't just change like this overnight unless something is wrong with their head. I saw the flicker in his eyes. The moment the anger turned into a different kind of calculation. He wasn't looking for an apology anymore. He was looking for a vulnerability. I've never been more sane, I said, pointing toward the rental car. Now, get off my property. I have a lot of work to do, and none of it involves you. As they retreated, shouting threats about lawyers and consequences, I didn't feel the old familiar pang of guilt. I felt a cold, exhilarating rush of power. They thought they could starve me of affection and still feast at my table. They were about to learn that when the banker leaves the building, the vault stays locked, and I was the only one with the combination. The silence following their departure was short-lived. 3 days later, the rental car returned, but this time it was accompanied by a sleek, black sedan. I watched from the window as Leo and Tiffany stepped out, dressed in somber, conservative clothing that looked like a costume for a funeral. Between them walked a man in a charcoal suit, clutching a leather briefcase with the kind of practiced solemnity one usually reserves for reading a will. I opened the door before they could knock. I didn't want the rhythmic pounding to disturb the peace I was beginning to cherish. Grace, the man in the suit began, extending a hand I did not take. My name is Howard Vance. I'm a family law associate. Your son and daughter-in-law have asked me to facilitate a very delicate conversation regarding the verbal agreements made prior to their nuptials. I stepped back, allowing them into the foyer, but I didn't offer them tea. I didn't offer them comfort. I sat in the high-backed armchair that had belonged to my husband, a throne of sorts, and watched them arrange themselves on the sofa like a panel of judges. Mom, Leo said, his voice dropping into a register of forced, saccharine concern. We've been talking to Mr. Vance about that afternoon last Christmas. You remember, don't you? When we sat in this very room and you told us how worried you were about our future. I leaned back, my eyes narrowing. I remember a lot of things about last Christmas, Leo. I remember paying for the catering. Tiffany let out a soft, theatrical sigh, reaching over to pat Leo's hand. Grace dear, we're worried that the stress of the wedding, and perhaps the heat lately, is making you a bit hazy. Mr. Vance has the notes on the promise you made. The one about the retirement fund being a living inheritance, so we could start our family business. Mr. Vance cleared his throat, opening his briefcase and sliding a document onto the coffee table. Mrs. Richter, my clients are under the impression that a verbal contract was established. They've made significant financial commitments based on your promise to transfer the bulk of your investment portfolio to them as a wedding gift. To suddenly rescind that Well, it suggests a level of cognitive inconsistency that is quite alarming. The air in the room grew cold. It wasn't just a request for money anymore. It was the opening move of a siege. They weren't just calling me a liar. They were calling me incompetent. They were suggesting that my refusal to be robbed was a symptom of a failing mind. Cognitive inconsistency. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the venom in them. Is that the legal term for she stopped signing the checks? Grace, please, Tiffany whispered, her eyes wide with fake pity. You were so confused at the door the other day. You were shouting about things that never happened. Leo and I cried all the way home. We think you might be having episodes. Moments where you forget the promises you've made to the people you love. I looked at Leo, waiting for him to look away, but he didn't. He stared back with a terrifyingly blank expression, a son who had traded his conscience for a chance at my bank account. He was nodding along to Tiffany's script, a willing participant in this senior moment strategy. A verbal contract, I said, picking up the document Mr. Vance had provided. It was a draft for a voluntary conservatorship, a document that would strip me of the right to buy a loaf of bread without their permission. This says that because of my declining memory, I should appoint Leo as the executor of my estate immediately to protect me from further mistakes. It's for your safety, Mom, Leo said, leaning forward. You've worked so hard. Why should you have to stress over numbers you can't quite keep track of anymore? Let us handle the burden. We'll make sure you're taken care of. We'll find a lovely place, somewhere with a garden, where professionals can look after you. The lovely place. I knew exactly what that meant. A room with a view and a locked door, while they spent my life's work on modern vibes and first-class tickets. I felt a roar of indignation rising in my chest, but I suppressed it. Anger was exactly what they wanted. Anger looked like agitation. Tears looked like confusion. Instead, I stood up and walked to the corner desk. I pulled out my teacher's planner, the one I had kept for 40 years and continued to use for my daily life. December 25th, I said, flipping the pages with a crisp, steady hand. Leo and Tiffany arrived at 2 p.m. We had roast beef. At 4:15 p.m., Tiffany asked if I would consider selling my stocks to pay for a destination wedding in Amalfi. I told her, and I quote my own notes, absolutely not. That money is for my old age, so I never have to be a burden on my son. I turned the book toward Mr. Vance. My handwriting was impeccable, the neat, cursive script of a woman who had taught 1,000 children how to form their letters. It was a chronological, daily record of every interaction, every gift, and every refusal. Does this look like the work of a hazy mind, Mr. Vance? I asked, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. I have 40 years of these journals. I have documented every emergency loan and every wedding gift they've bullied out of me. And I've documented every time I told them, no. Tiffany's face transformed. The pity vanished, replaced by a snarling, panicked greed. You're making that up. You're rewriting those books now to spite us. I'm a retired teacher, Tiffany, I said, closing the book with a thud that sounded like a gavel. I don't rewrite history, I grade it. And right now, both of you are failing. I turned to the lawyer, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Vance, if you proceed with this conservatorship, based on these lies, I will not only sue my son for every cent he has taken from me under false pretenses, but I will file a grievance against your firm for predatory practice against a senior citizen. I am perfectly lucid, and my memory is sharp enough to remember that you haven't yet produced a single shred of evidence for this promise, other than the word of 2 people who are currently broke. Leo stood up, his face flushed. You can't do this, Mom. You're being cruel. No, Leo, I said, walking to the front door and swinging it wide. I'm being modern. I'm prioritizing my own vibe. And my vibe doesn't include people who try to steal my mind because they can't have my money. As they scrambled out the door, Tiffany's heels clicking frantically on the pavement, I felt a cold, hard shield settle over my heart. They had tried to gaslight me into a cage. They had tried to turn my age into a prison. But they had forgotten one thing. I had spent my life teaching children how to follow the rules, and I knew exactly what happened to those who tried to cheat on the final exam. I went back to my chair, picked up my pen, and began to write. July 14th. The children attempted to claim I am mentally unfit. The battle has officially begun. The following Tuesday, a sleek sedan pulled into my driveway, carrying a man who didn't look like a relative or a lawyer. He was soft-spoken, dressed in a professional knit sweater, and carried a leather-bound tablet. Beside him, Leo and Tiffany stood with their heads bowed in a performance of choreographed grief, as if they were already mourning a mother who was still very much alive. "Grace," Leo said, his voice trembling with a forced, watery emotion. "This is Dr. Eris. He's a specialist. We told him how worried we are about the outbursts, the paranoia, and how you've started rewriting your journals. We just want to make sure there isn't a medical reason for why you're pushing us away." I didn't bar the door. To do so would have played right into their hands, giving them the agitation they so desperately needed for their report. Instead, I opened it wide, a pleasant classroom-ready smile fixed on my face. "A specialist. How thoughtful of you, Leo. I suppose after 40 years of grading the minds of others, it's only fair someone finally takes a look at mine. Please, come into the parlor." I led them into the room where my journals sat prominently on the mahogany desk. 40 years of bound history. I sat in my favorite wingback chair, the light from the bay window illuminating every wrinkle on my face, which I wore not as a sign of decay, but as a map of experience. Dr. Eris sat across from me, his eyes scanning the room for signs of neglect, heaped mail, dust, or unwashed dishes. He found none. My home was as orderly as a well-run library. "Mrs. Richter," he began, his voice condescendingly gentle, "your son mentioned you've been having some trouble remembering financial agreements. He's concerned that you might be experiencing some disorientation regarding time and place." Disorientation. I laughed, a light melodic sound that lacked any trace of the hysteria Tiffany was likely hoping for. "Well, doctor, let's test that. It is 10:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. We are in my home at 412 Oak Lane, a property I purchased in 1994 for $112,000 and which I currently own free and clear. My mortgage was paid off on September 12, 2014. Does that seem disoriented to you?" Tiffany shifted on the sofa, her face tightening. "It's not the dates, Grace. It's the behavior. You've become so aggressive. You're cutting off your family. You're acting like we're enemies." I turned my gaze to her, my eyes cold and sharp. "I'm acting like a woman who has realized her ROI is in the negatives, Tiffany. Doctor, since you're here to evaluate my cognitive function, perhaps you'd like to see how I track my episodes." I reached for the journal on the table, the one from 3 years ago. On page 42, I have a record of a loan I gave Leo for a business startup. $5,000. On page 86, another $3,000 for Tiffany's emergency dental work, which strangely coincided with a new designer wardrobe. My memory isn't failing. It's simply becoming too accurate for their comfort. They aren't worried that I'm losing my mind. They're terrified that I've found it. Dr. Eris looked at the journal, then at Leo, who was beginning to sweat under the collar of his expensive shirt. The doctor began a standard battery of cognitive questions, repeating words, drawing a clock, identifying the current president. I answered them with a speed and wit that made the exercises seem insulting. When he asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, I did it while simultaneously reciting the list of monthly expenses I had recently cut from Leo's luxury car insurance. 93, 86, 79, I said, my voice steady and rhythmic. That's also exactly how many dollars Tiffany spent on a silk pillowcase, using my emergency card last month before I cancelled it. 72, 65. Shall I continue, or have we established that my numeracy is quite intact? The silence in the room became heavy. Dr. Eris tapped his pen against his tablet. He wasn't looking at a woman in decline. He was looking at a woman in a state of high alert defense. He looked at Leo and Tiffany, whose concern was starting to look more like the frustrated anger of a failed heist. Mrs. Richter, Dr. Eris said, his tone shifting from clinical pity to genuine respect. I see no evidence of the cognitive impairment described in the referral. In fact, your recall is significantly higher than the average for your age group. Your decisions regarding your finances seem to be based on a very clear, documented history of personal conflict, not neurological decay. But doctor, Tiffany gasped, her voice shrill. She's excluding us. She's being spiteful. That has to be a personality change. A personality change is not a medical diagnosis for a conservatorship, Tiffany, I said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. In the teaching world, we call this consequences. You wanted a modern vibe for your wedding, remember? You wanted a world where I was more comfortable at home. Well, I am very comfortable. I am so comfortable that I've decided to keep my retirement fund exactly where it belongs, with me. Dr. Eris stood up and closed his tablet. Leo, I'll be filing my report stating that your mother is fully capable of managing her own affairs. I would advise you to resolve your family disputes without involving the medical board in the future. As they scrambled toward the door, Leo tried to catch my eye, his face a mask of panicked defeat. He knew what this meant. The medical route was closed. The gaslighting had failed. The senior moment strategy had been dismantled by the very mind they tried to claim was broken. I stood on the porch, watching their car pull away for the fourth time. My mind was a steel trap, and they were the ones caught in it. I went back inside, picked up my red pen, and opened my journal to a fresh page. Evaluation complete. I wrote in my perfect teacher's script. Diagnosis. Perfectly sane. Prognosis. For Leo and Tiffany, it's going to be a very expensive winter. I felt a cold, exhilarating rush. They had tried to trap me in a cage of old age, but all they had done was remind me that I was the one who held the keys to the kingdom. The victory over the doctor's evaluation had left a quiet, cold stillness in my house. I was no longer the confused old woman they wanted me to be, but the mystery of their cruelty still had missing pieces. Why the sudden rush? Why the absolute erasure of my presence from a day I had funded? The answer came late on a rainy Thursday night, delivered through the digital back door they forgot to lock. I had been browsing the social media page of a young woman who had once been my student, a girl named Maya who had grown up to be a local photographer. She had been hired as a second shooter for the wedding, a detail Leo and Tiffany had never mentioned. Unlike the official curated vibe photos Tiffany posted, Maya's page featured candid, behind-the-scenes clips of her work. There, buried in a highlight reel titled The Modern Estate Series, was a video that the special people never intended for me to see. I clicked play, my breath hitching in the dark kitchen. The video was shot during the reception, under the soft glow of the marble fireplace in the estate I had rented for them. The guests were flushed with the premium open bar I had paid for, and the laughter was loud and sharp. Tiffany stood in the center of the room, her designer gown shimmering, holding a microphone in one hand and a glass of vintage champagne in the other. I just want to thank everyone for being so on brand, Tiffany said into the mic, her voice dripping with a casual, terrifying arrogance. The room erupted in cheers. She leaned in closer, a conspiratorial smirk crossing her face. I know some people were worried about the empty chair in the front row, but let's be real. We're building a legacy here, a youthful, high-end aesthetic. We couldn't exactly have a dusty, retired schoolteacher in the wedding portraits, could we? It would have ruined the entire grid. A roar of laughter followed. I saw Leo standing just behind her. He wasn't stopping her. He wasn't defending the woman who had spent 40 years in a classroom to ensure he never wanted for a thing. He was laughing along with them, nodding as he took a sip of his drink. Grace served her purpose, Tiffany continued, waving her glass dismissively. She paid the deposit, she covered the beauty tax, and now she's back in her little one-bedroom apartment where she belongs. She's too old to understand the vibe, but she's just rich enough to fund it. To the bank of Mom. May she stay closed and quiet for the rest of the night. The guests toasted to the camera, their faces blurred by the motion of the lens, but the words were crystal clear. Dusty. Grid. Bank of Mom. I sat there, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes, and felt the last tether of my maternal instinct snap. It didn't feel like a heartbreak. It felt like a cold, steel door slamming shut. They hadn't just excluded me. They had choreographed my humiliation as a form of entertainment for their friends. They had used my life savings to buy the very stage they used to mock my existence. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I watched the video again, and then a third time, my eyes fixed on Leo's smiling face. I used a screen recording tool to capture every second of it. I saved the file under the name The Secret Vows. This was the evidence the doctor couldn't provide and the journals couldn't prove. It was a confession of intent. It was proof that the early inheritance wasn't a gift, but a ransom paid to people who viewed me as an obsolete piece of hardware. They thought I was dusty, something to be swept aside and forgotten. They didn't realize that dust is what remains after everything else has burned down. I stood up and walked to my desk, my movements fluid and precise. I pulled out my red pen one last time. I didn't write a letter of grief. I began an itemized bill of costs. Every penny of that wedding, every gifted car payment, every designer bag Tiffany had accidentally charged, I listed them all under a new heading: services not rendered. The modern vibe they were so proud of was about to meet the old-school reality of debt and consequence. They wanted a life without the dusty mother-in-law? Fine. They would have it. But they wouldn't have her money, her house, or her silence ever again. I closed the laptop and looked out at the rain. For years, I had worried about being a burden on my son. Now, as I watched the digital recording of their betrayal, I realized the only burden in this family was the weight of his own greed. I wasn't just too old for their wedding. I was too smart for their games. I went to bed and slept the deep, peaceful sleep of a woman who was no longer a mother to a ghost, but a general preparing for the final strike. The vibe was about to become very, very expensive. The digital recording of Tiffany's secret vows was still glowing on my laptop screen when I called my attorney Evelyn at 7 o'clock the following morning. I didn't open with a greeting. I didn't offer a preamble about my feelings. I simply told her that the time for defense had ended and the time for a total reclamation had begun. I have proof of intent, Evelyn, I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a winter frost. I have a video of them admitting that my financial contributions were obtained under the false pretense of being a mother, while they internally categorized me as a bank. Every cent I've given them was a transaction based on a lie. I want it all back. Evelyn, a woman who had spent 30 years dismantling the greed of ungrateful heirs, didn't hesitate. By that afternoon, the paperwork for a lawsuit for unjust enrichment and fraudulent inducement was drafted. The centerpiece was the $25,000 gift I had handed over for their house down payment, a gift predicated on the promise that it would be the foundation of our family's future together. Since they had decided I was dusty baggage and not family, the legal basis for that gift had evaporated. 2 days later, I sat on my porch and watched as a process server walked up the driveway of the house my money had helped buy. Leo and Tiffany were coming out the front door, dressed for a brunch they likely couldn't afford, when the server tapped Leo on the shoulder. I saw the flash of white paper, the confused tilt of Leo's head, and then the sudden ashen drain of color from his face as he realized what he was holding. Tiffany snatched the papers from his hand, her modern composure shattering instantly. Even from across the lawn, I could hear the shrill, panicked pitch of her voice as she read the demand for the immediate return of the $25,000, plus the itemized costs of the beauty tax and the estate rental. The counterstrike was a masterclass in precision. By filing for unjust enrichment, we weren't just asking for money. We were challenging the very nature of their lifestyle. We were arguing that they had accepted funds under the guise of a relationship they had already decided to terminate. They had eaten the cake, but I was now demanding they pay for the bakery. An hour later, the rental car, now looking worse for wear, screeched into my driveway for the fifth and most desperate time. Leo didn't even wait for the car to stop before he was out and running toward me. "Are you insane, Mom? he bellowed, waving the legal summons in the air. A lawsuit? Against your own son? We don't have $25,000. We spent it on the closing costs and the renovations you suggested. If you go through with this, we'll lose the house. We'll be bankrupt. Tiffany was right behind him, her eyes red-rimmed and predatory. You can't do this, Grace. That money was a gift. You signed a gift letter for the mortgage company. You'll be committing perjury if you say it was anything else. I stood up from my wicker chair, my movements slow and deliberate. I pulled my phone from my pocket and pressed play on the video Maya had captured. Tiffany's voice, amplified and cruel, filled the porch. She's too old to understand the vibe, but she's just rich enough to fund it. To the bank of Mom. May she stay closed and quiet. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than the humid summer air. Tiffany's mouth hung open, her face turning a blotchy, ugly purple. Leo looked like he had been struck. A gift letter is a legal document based on the assumption of a familial bond, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. That video proves that you two were engaged in a conspiracy to defraud a senior citizen. You used me as a line of credit while planning my social erasure. My lawyer calls that unjust enrichment. I call it the price of your vibe. Mom, please, Leo whispered, the bravado collapsing into a pathetic, whiny plea. It was just a joke. Tiffany was just being. She was stressed. We can fix this. We'll have a second ceremony. A big one, just for you. A second ceremony? I let out a short, jagged laugh. So I can pay for that one too? No. Leo. You wanted a world where I was comfortable at home, and out of your way. Well, this is me being comfortable. I'm comfortable knowing that every cent I worked 40 years for is coming back to me, even if it means you have to sell the very walls I paid for. We'll fight this. Tiffany screamed, her nails digging into her palms. We'll tell the court you're vindictive. We'll tell them you're obsessed. Tell them whatever you like, I said, turning to walk back into my house. But while you're telling stories, my lawyer will be filing a lien against your property. You wanted a modern life, Tiffany. Well, in the modern world, when you don't pay your debts, you lose your assets. And as for being obsessed, I'm not obsessed with you. I'm finally obsessed with me. I closed the door and locked it, not out of fear, but out of a desire for the vibe of my own sanctuary. Through the window, I watched them stand in the driveway, two children who had tried to play a grown-up game of greed and lost. They looked small. They looked broke. And for the first time in 68 years, I realized that the only person who was truly special in this family was the one who was brave enough to stop being a victim. The counter-strike was complete. Now, all that was left was the final bill. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom were far less glamorous than the chandeliers of the estate I had rented for Leo's wedding, but they were infinitely more honest. I sat at the petitioner's table, my silver silk suit finally serving its purpose, not as a mother of the groom costume, but as the armor of a woman reclaiming her throne. Across the aisle, Leo and Tiffany looked like ghosts of their former selves. The modern vibe had curdled into a sickly gray desperation. Their designer clothes were wrinkled, and their arrogance had been replaced by the frantic whispering of people who realized their bluff had been called. When the judge spoke, her voice was a gavel of cold reality. She didn't just rule in my favor. She delivered a lecture on the repugnant nature of financial exploitation. She cited the Secret Vows video as a clear admission of a predatory relationship. The verdict was absolute. The $25,000 down payment was to be returned in full. The early inheritance was reclassified as a high-interest loan, and a lien was placed on their home to ensure I was paid first. As the judge's mallet struck the wooden block, I didn't feel a rush of maternal grief. I felt the weight of 40 years of walking on eggshells evaporate. Outside on the courthouse steps, Leo tried to grab my arm, his eyes welling with the same performative tears that used to make me reach for my checkbook. Mom, the bank is going to foreclose. We have nowhere to go. You can't do this to us. Think of our future. I stopped and looked at him, not with anger, but with the profound indifference one feels for a stranger. I am thinking of a future, Leo. Mine. You told me I'd be more comfortable at home. It turns out, I'm even more comfortable without the burden of people who only love me when the vault is open. I didn't wait to see them walk to their beat-up rental car. I had my own vibe to attend to. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign on my own lawn was replaced with a sold sticker. I didn't need the 3-bedroom house anymore. It was filled with the echoes of a woman who apologized for existing. I held an estate sale that stripped the house to its bones, selling off the furniture Leo had always coveted and the silver Tiffany had already mentally appraised. Every dollar went into a new account, one that didn't have any authorized users. The final morning, I stood in my driveway next to my new purchase, a luxury 24-foot Class A motorhome. It was a marvel of modern engineering, sleek, silver, and entirely self-contained. It didn't have a guest room. It didn't have a grid to maintain. It had a state-of-the-art kitchen, a master suite with a skylight, and a GPS that was already programmed for the Pacific Coast Highway. As I was loading my last suitcase, a taxi pulled up. Leo climbed out, looking disheveled and small. He stared at the massive RV, then at me. "You're leaving?" "Just like that. Tiffany's parents won't help us, and we have to move into a studio apartment. How can you live like this, knowing we're struggling?" I climbed into the driver's seat, the engine purring with a power that made my chest hum. I looked down at him from the window, adjusting my sunglasses. "Leo, you were right about one thing," I said, my voice steady and light. "I was too old for your wedding. But I'm just the right age to start my own life. You and Tiffany wanted a world without elderly baggage. Well, congratulations. The baggage is gone, and it took all the money with it." I didn't look back in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the driveway. I didn't check my phone when it began to buzz with the inevitable, frantic texts. I headed for the open road, the horizon stretching out like a clean, unwritten page. The freedom vibe was better than anything Tiffany could have ever curated. It was the sound of a mountain breeze, the taste of a meal I didn't have to share, and the absolute, crystalline silence of a bank that was officially, permanently closed. I wasn't a dusty mother-in-law anymore. I was a woman with a full tank of gas, a sharp mind, and a world that was finally, for the first time in 68 years, all mine. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.